Picture this scene, if you can. Every night for 4 years, one of the world's most respected psychiatrists would lock himself in his study, light a single candle against the encroaching darkness, and deliberately descend into what most would consider the realm of madness itself. Carl Jung was not treating patients during these hours. Those careful, controlled sessions that had built his reputation lay abandoned as he became his own most dangerous case study, documenting visions that defied everything he had been trained to believe about sanity, psychological health, and the very boundaries between self and cosmos. Night after night, Jung would enter a meditative state that he called active imagination, allowing his conscious mind to recede like a tide, making space for images to emerge from some deep, primordial layer of his psyche that seemed to exist beyond personal memory, beyond individual experience. What arose were not the familiar symbols of dream or fantasy, but ancient figures speaking in forgotten tongues, serpentine creatures that seemed to embody wisdom older than civilization itself. A blind woman named Salome, who begged for his love with an intensity that bordered on the cosmic, her sightless eyes reflecting depths that his rational mind could neither fathom nor dismiss. These were not random eruptions of an overstressed psyche, not the chaotic fragments that psychiatry had taught him to categorize and medicate away, but seemed instead to represent archetypal forces that had been awakened by some profound psychological rupture, as if his break with everything familiar had torn open a veil between worlds, allowing inhabitants of a deeper reality to pour through into his carefully ordered existence. He recorded everything in meticulous detail in what would become known as the Red Book, a hand-illuminated manuscript that reads like a medieval grimoire crossed with a psychological case study, each page crafted with the devotion of a monk transcribing sacred text. The calligraphy flows across handmade paper with deliberate beauty, surrounded by mandalas and serpentine figures painted in colors that seem to pulse with their own inner light, as if Jung understood that he was documenting something that existed at the very edge of human experience, something that demanded not just intellectual attention, but aesthetic reverence. I was going about with all these fantasies in my head, Jung later confessed, with the careful precision of a man describing symptoms he still wasn't certain weren't pathological, and I was seriously afraid that I was menaced by a psychosis. The word hangs in the air with all its clinical weight. Psychosis, that territory beyond the pale of acceptable human experience, that realm from which his training told him few returned unchanged. Yet, he continued, driven by an intuition that this descent was not pathological but necessary, not a breakdown but a breaking open, that something within him was demanding to be born even if it meant the death of everything he had been, everything he thought he knew about the nature of mind and reality. Rilke, in those letters that would comfort generations of seekers, wrote, "The only sadnesses that are dangerous and unhealthy are the ones that we carry around in public in order to drown them out. They are like diseases that are treated superficially and never cured. They just sink deeper and after a while break out again all the more terribly." Jung's willingness to face his inner chaos directly, to give it form and voice and conscious attention, was perhaps the only path towards something resembling truth, not the comfortable truth of academic consensus, but the terrible, transformative truth that emerges only when we stop defending ourselves against the depths of our own experience. What would possess a rational man, a scientist trained in the methodologies of empirical observation, to deliberately court what appeared to be insanity? What was he searching for in those dark waters of the unconscious that was worth risking not just his reputation, not just his career, but his very grip on the reality that others took for granted? This is the story of how shadow work was born, not in the sterile confines of academic theory, but in the crucible of one man's willingness to follow his own dissolution wherever it might lead. If something in that hit a nerve, stay with me. Through his encounters with these inner figures, conversations that lasted hours, dialogues that felt more real than most of his interactions with the walking world, Jung began to recognize the presence of what he would later term the shadow, though the word itself seems inadequate to capture what he discovered there. This was not merely the repressed or negative aspects of personality that psychology had learned to catalogue and treat, but something far more complex and threatening to the organized self. The unlived life, the authentic self that had been systematically buried beneath layers of social conditioning, professional respectability, and the thousand small compromises that transform a soul into a successful persona. Jung's shadow, as it emerged through his visions with a clarity that cut through decades of self-deception, was not some demonic presence lurking in the basement of consciousness, but rather the parts of himself he had disowned in his climb toward success, the aspects of his nature that had been sacrificed on the altar of becoming who others needed him to be. The ambitious young man who had desperately sought approval from authority figures, the intellectual who had built his entire identity on rational analysis and scholarly achievement, the respected professional who had learned to perform competence like a carefully rehearsed role in a play whose script he had never consciously chosen. All of these were revealed as masks, personas that had gradually severed him from his deeper nature with the slow precision of a surgeon's blade. The confrontation, when it came, was brutal in its honesty. In his visions, Jung encountered aspects of himself that challenged every comfortable assumption about who he was, aspects that spoke with his voice but said things he would never consciously admit, that carried his face but expressed desires and fears he had spent decades learning to suppress with the disciplined efficiency of a well-trained mind. The shadow was, in the most terrifying sense, more authentically him than the personality he had carefully constructed for the world. It was Jung, unedited. Jung, without the civilizing influences of professional training and social expectation. Jung as he might have been if he had never learned to hide from himself. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung would later write, with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had tested this truth in the crucible of his own experience, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. This was not a comfortable process of self-improvement, not the gentle cultivation of positive qualities that self-help literature would later promise, but a genuine psychological death, the dismantling of everything he thought he knew about himself, and the slow, painful reconstruction of something more real, more whole, and infinitely more frightening to maintain. The shadow work Jung pioneered was not about eliminating negative traits or perfecting the personality through disciplined effort, but about developing a conscious relationship with the totality of who we are, including those aspects that contradict our preferred self-image. It required him to acknowledge the grandiosity that had driven his ambition, the neediness that had made him seek recognition from Freud and the psychoanalytic community, the arrogance that had convinced him he could understand the human psyche through intellect alone, the very human desires for power and approval that he had learned to disguise as scientific objectivity and humanitarian concern. This was shadow work in its rawest form, not as a technique to be applied or a problem to be solved, but as a fundamental reorientation toward the totality of human experience, a willingness to include rather than exclude, to conscious rather than repress, to dialogue rather than dominate. The shadow, Jung discovered, was not his enemy, but his estranged twin, carrying gifts that could only be received through the difficult intimacy of conscious relationship. Have you ever caught a glimpse of yourself in an unguarded moment, in the heat of anger that reveals depths of rage you didn't know you possessed, in a spike of jealousy that illuminates the desperate neediness beneath your composed exterior, in a moment of desperate need that strips away all pretense, and recognize someone you barely knew, someone whose existence you had been carefully denying for years, someone who might be more genuinely you than the person you present to the world? If you're finding something here that resonates with your own journey of self-discovery, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to join others who are walking this path of psychological exploration. But how does a man arrive at such a desperate experiment? How does someone who has achieved everything the world calls valuable find himself willing to risk it all for the sake of an inner truth he cannot yet name? To understand Jung's descent into the underworld of his own psyche, we must first witness the life he was descending from. A life that by every external measure represented the pinnacle of professional and personal achievement, the very embodiment of what ambitious young men dreamed of becoming. By 1912, Carl Jung had achieved everything a man of his era could desire. Everything that society promised would bring fulfillment and meaning. International recognition as a pioneering psychiatrist whose word association tests had revolutionized the understanding of mental illness, financial security that freed him from the material concerns that plagued most of his contemporaries, the respect of colleagues worldwide who looked to him as one of the rising stars in the new science of the mind, and perhaps most significantly, the blessing of Sigmund Freud himself, who had anointed him as heir apparent to the psychoanalytic throne, the chosen successor to carry forward the work of mapping the human unconscious. Jung was not merely successful, he was the embodiment of what success was supposed to look like in the intellectual world of early 20th century Europe. His practice thrived, his theories were discussed in the most prestigious circles, his marriage to Emma provided him with the stability and social standing that ambitious men required, and his position as president of the International Psychoanalytic Association placed him at the very center of psychology's revolutionary moment. He had, in every measurable way, won the game that ambitious young men learn to play almost from birth. Yet beneath this carefully constructed existence, something was stirring, something that would soon reveal the profound emptiness at the heart of his achievements. The way that external success can become its own form of imprisonment. Jung is said to have later described this period as living within a gilded cage, successful on every external measure while simultaneously feeling as though he was dying from within, as if each new achievement added another bar to a prison whose walls were invisible to everyone but himself. The very accomplishments that the world celebrated had become, paradoxically, the source of his growing sense of existential despair. Each success a step further away from whatever authentic self lay buried beneath the accumulated layers of professional identity and social expectation. He was, in his own words, a splendid example of the man who has fulfilled all social expectations, playing his role with the practiced competence of a seasoned actor, yet feeling increasingly like someone trapped in a performance he no longer remembered choosing, someone whose real life was happening somewhere else, to someone else, while he continued to mouth the lines that others expected to hear. The persona he had so carefully crafted, the brilliant analyst, the devoted husband, the rising star of European psychiatry, had become a prison whose walls grew higher with each new achievement, each new recognition, each new invitation to become more of what others needed him to be. Jung began to sense, with the slow horror of gradual awakening, that his success was built on a fundamental betrayal, a betrayal of some deeper, unnamed part of himself that watched from the shadows as he played the role expected of him, that observed with increasing dismay as he became more accomplished at being someone else. The more he succeeded in becoming who others wanted him to be, the more distant he became from whoever he actually was. The more skilled he became at a life that felt increasingly like an elaborate form of self-abandonment. The recognition crept in slowly, the way dawn breaks over a landscape that reveals itself to be utterly different from what it appeared in darkness. He had achieved everything, and it meant nothing. Or rather, it meant something. It meant the systematic denial of whatever authentic self had been waiting in the wings while his persona took center stage. It meant the careful cultivation of a life that looked perfect from the outside, while feeling hollow at its core. Have you ever achieved something you thought you wanted, only to discover that success itself felt like a form of betrayal? A betrayal of some deeper, unnamed part of yourself that had been systematically silenced by your own ambition, that had been taught to wait patiently in the wings while you became who others needed you to be, who watched with growing sadness as you became more skilled at being anyone but yourself. If any of this sounds uncomfortably familiar, don't turn away yet. The catalyst came in 1913 with Jung's break from Freud, a rupture that was not merely professional but existential, cutting him off from the intellectual father who had given his life meaning and direction, severing him from the theoretical framework that had organized his understanding of human psychology and leaving him suddenly, terrifyingly alone with questions that had no sanctioned answers. When Jung published his revolutionary ideas about the collective unconscious and the nature of libido in Symbols of Transformation, he wasn't just challenging psychological theory. He was severing himself from the only intellectual family he had ever known, choosing the uncertainty of his own path over the security of established doctrine. The Freudian community's immediate and brutal rejection felt like excommunication from everything that had defined his professional identity. Colleagues who had once celebrated his insights now dismissed him as a mystic, his theories derided as unscientific romanticism, his ideas treated with the kind of intellectual contempt usually reserved for charlatans and dilettantes. The isolation was devastating, not just professionally, where doors that had once opened eagerly now remained firmly closed, but psychologically, as if the ground of reality itself had shifted beneath his feet, leaving him standing on territory that no one else recognized as valid. What followed was what Jung himself described as the most difficult experiment of his life, though at the time, it felt less like an experiment than an assault from forces beyond his control, as if his break with consensus reality had torn open some protective barrier that had kept the chaos of the unconscious safely contained. The symptoms began subtly, the way a fever announces itself with barely perceptible changes in temperature. Vivid dreams that lingered long after waking, carrying with them the weight of ancient significance, a sense of being watched by invisible presences that seemed to follow him through his days. Voices that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond rational explanation, speaking words that his conscious mind could neither understand nor dismiss. An incessant stream of fantasies had been released, Jung later wrote in his memoir, with the careful precision of a man describing symptoms he still wasn't certain weren't pathological. I stood helpless before an alien world. Everything in it seemed difficult and incomprehensible. The man who had spent his career analyzing the unconscious minds of others, who had prided himself on his ability to navigate the territory between conscious and unconscious experience, now found himself at the mercy of his own psyche, as if some dam had burst and released floods of psychic material that threatened to drown his conscious mind entirely, leaving him gasping for breath in an ocean of symbols and visions and voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The isolation deepened with each passing day, his marriage strained under the weight of his inner turmoil as Emma watched her husband disappear into regions she could neither understand nor follow. His remaining professional relationships grew increasingly tenuous as colleagues began to question not just his theories, but his sanity, and he found himself questioning not just his career or his intellectual positions, but his fundamental grip on reality itself. How many of us, in our darkest moments, have felt the familiar world dissolve around us like sugar in rain, not knowing whether we were experiencing a breakdown or a breakthrough, whether to trust the voice of rational control that urged us to retreat into the safety of the known, or the terrifying whisper of something deeper and more authentic demanding to be heard, demanding that we follow it into territories that had no names, no maps, no promise of safe return. I'm curious about your own relationship with the parts of yourself you've learned to keep hidden. What would it mean to approach them with curiosity rather than judgment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Now we can see the profound irony of Jung's story, the paradox that would define not just his personal transformation, but his revolutionary contribution to human understanding. His near collapse was not an obstacle to his life's work. It was the foundation of it, the necessary destruction that made possible the birth of something entirely new. Every concept that would later make him one of psychology's most influential figures emerged directly from his willingness to follow his psychological crisis to its ultimate conclusion, to remain present with chaos until it revealed its hidden order, to trust the process of dissolution even when it threatened to erase everything he thought he knew about himself and reality. The collective, unconscious, archetypal psychology, the process of individuation, active imagination, the transcendent function, all of these revolutionary insights were born from his descent into what others might have dismissed as elaborate mental illness, what colleagues certainly interpreted as evidence of his professional decline. But Jung's breakdown was not a falling apart, but a falling into, of falling into depths of experience that most people spend their lives carefully avoiding. Depths that contained not just personal material, but what he would come to recognize as the shared inheritance of human consciousness itself. The transformation that emerged from Jung's years of inner work was not a return to his previous state, not a restoration of the successful professional who had entered the crisis, but something entirely new, a way of being that could hold both light and darkness without needing to choose between them, that could embrace consciousness and unconscious wisdom as complementary rather than contradictory aspects of a larger wholeness. This was what he would come to call individuation, not the perfection of personality, but the psychological process of becoming who you truly are, beneath all the layers of conditioning and expectation, rather than who you think you should be or who others need you to become. Jung's relationship with his inner figures evolved from terror to dialogue, from being overwhelmed by forces beyond his understanding to engaging them as teachers, guides, and intimate aspects of his own psyche that had been waiting patiently for conscious recognition. Philemon, the wise old man of his visions, became an internal mentor whose guidance transcended anything his rational mind could produce, offering perspectives that seemed to emerge from depths of wisdom that belonged not just to Jung, but to the collective experience of humanity itself. The chaotic energies that had once threatened to destroy him became sources of unprecedented creativity and insight, fueling work that would influence not just psychology, but philosophy, anthropology, theology, and the arts. The shadow that had initially appeared as an enemy, as the very force that threatened to undermine everything he had built, was revealed through patient attention to be an estranged ally, carrying gifts that could only be received through the difficult intimacy of conscious relationship. This was perhaps Jung's most radical discovery, that the aspects of ourselves we most fear and reject often contain the very qualities we most need to become whole, that what we call pathology might sometimes be the psyche's attempt to break free from patterns that have become too narrow to contain the fullness of who we are. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, Jung wrote near the end of his life, with the authority of someone who had tested this truth in the crucible of his own experience. This becoming, he discovered, was not a comfortable process of self-actualization, not the gentle unfolding that spiritual traditions sometimes promise, but a series of deaths and rebirths, each one requiring the courage to release what we think we know about ourselves in service of what wants to emerge from depths we cannot control or predict. Shadow work, as Jung came to understand it through the laboratory of his own transformation, is not a psychological technique to be applied like a therapeutic intervention, not a problem to be solved through disciplined effort, but a way of living, a fundamental commitment to remaining conscious in relationship with the full spectrum of human experience, including those aspects that contradict our preferred self-image. It asks us to develop what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension without rushing toward resolution, to remain present with paradox without collapsing it into comfortable certainty, to find meaning in suffering without immediately seeking to eliminate it. Nietzsche, that other great explorer of human depths, wrote, "One must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star." Jung's chaos was not an accident or a pathology to be corrected, not a deviation from the path of healthy development, but the necessary condition for the birth of a new way of understanding human consciousness, not just intellectually, but experientially, not just as theory, but as lived reality. What chaos in your own life might you have been trying to eliminate when it was actually trying to give birth to something new, something that could only emerge through your willingness to let the old structures die, to remain present with the dissolution of familiar patterns until something more authentic had space to emerge? If this touched something buried, keep going. You're not alone in this. If this exploration of Jung's journey has opened something for you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear that their own struggles could be the beginning of their greatest transformation. And subscribe if you'd like to continue exploring these depths together. Perhaps the real story behind shadow work is not that Jung nearly lost his mind, but that he found it. Found it by having the courage to lose everything he thought he knew about himself. found it by following the thread of his own dissolution into territories that had no maps, no guarantees, no promise of safe return. In the end, his breakdown was his breakthrough. His descent was his ascension. His willingness to embrace the darkness became the source of a light that continues to illuminate the path for those who choose to follow. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. Jung reminds us with the quiet authority of someone who has tested this truth in the laboratory of his own transformation. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves.